You are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke Makenna, but today's case is about murder that was captured on live television. A crime within a crime, a murder that caused many to question their own idea of what justice truly is. The story of two heroes being created, but one of which didn't have a choice. Now, if you don't know, it's my absolute passion to tell these stories. I mean no harm or disrespect when I do so. So if that's something you'd like to support me in doing, all you have to do is make sure you subscribe with the post notification bell on, giving this video a thumbs up, and leave a nice comment down below. Now let's get back to the story. So it was 1984 in Louisiana, and the Baton Rouge airport had another plane land on March 16th at around 9:08 p.m. Passengers disembarked, everything went as normal, the airplane ride was smooth, and they started walking through the busy airport. However, suddenly out of nowhere, this already chaotic space of an airport turned into pure horror. Passengers were screaming, they were running away, they were trying to get away from something they didn't even quite know what it was. However, they would later find out that somebody had hit the ground dead. One of the passengers who were on that plane. Now, this was after Baton Rouge, Louisiana had already really turned into a place of crime where media was reporting things like this happening, because a month prior to this, on February 19th, an 11-year-old boy had been kidnapped. His name was Jody Plache, and he had lived there a long time with his parents, Gary and June, and his three siblings. He loved to play football, basketball, and especially do karate, and he was just a very active, happy child. Jody was also a very good boy, whom investigators were told adamantly by his parents that he would have never run away. The search began and quickly spread across the country because his father, Gary, had been very close with some of the detectives in the area, so they were more than willing to help search for Jody. It turned out that everyone thought that someone close to the family actually had something to do with it. This was Jody's karate teacher. Now, he was actually someone that was close to the whole family. He was friends with Gary and June. He taught 3 out of their 4 children, and they were there and hanging out with him all the time. He had actually picked Jody up for a ride around the neighborhood the day he vanished and said that he would be back with him in 15 minutes, but when he was a little late, June really didn't think of this as something to be concerned about. In fact, more than him being abducted, she believes that they had both gotten in some sort of accident or something happened to both of them. The kids all said that this man was their best friend, and at the beginning of the search, Gary and June were completely baffled that this friend of theirs could do something like this. A week later, they would get a call to their home phone, and June would answer the phone, and a scared Jody was on the other end. June and Gary immediately informed the police that Jody was on the phone, and so they were actually able to trace the call. They were able to do this because it was collect call, so they found the exact location. They honed in on this motel in Anaheim, California, and this was around 2,000 miles from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and it was actually a motel that was pretty close to Disneyland, so they wondered if Jody had been taken there. But as officers went to this motel, the ones who had already, lived and worked in the area so they could get to him as quickly as possible, they knocked the door down, and inside they found 2 people. However, they feared that they had the wrong room because there was a little boy and there was a man, but this little boy had black hair instead of the blonde that Jody had. And then this man didn't have a beard like the karate teacher was thought to have. However, when they looked at the face of the little boy, they knew they had the right room because he was terrified. You could see it in his eyes. They pulled Jody into safety while they put the man in handcuffs, and Jody was actually shaking. He was being told, don't be scared, you're safe, but he said he was more scared of their guns being pointed in his face than being in the hotel with this man. Jody's mother, June, was actually on the phone with his abductor in the hotel when the cops barged in. So the last thing she heard was chaos as the cops knocked down the door, and then the abductor dropped the call. The plan was to get Jody home as soon as possible and then kind of ask him for his story and go through the healing process there after he was with his family. However, the abductor would be kept in custody in California till they decided whether they were going to try him in California or in Louisiana.
First, he started telling me about his own life as growing up and how he was molested as a child.
He had confessed to molesting a number of children many times. He couldn't even remember how many times. We were going to build a case against him and was going to send him to the penitentiary for the rest of his life.
Meanwhile, Gary and June were having to come to terms with the fact that they hadn't been able to keep their son safe. Even though they had done everything that a parent tries to do, they had let this man into their lives, this teacher, and had let him become someone that they trusted. The Baton Rouge sheriff, who was Mike Barnett, knew the family personally and actually wanted to tell them what happened to their son during this time. It took investigators a lot of questioning to get the real truth out of Jody. He didn't want to tell them what had actually happened, especially the more gruesome details. But eventually, Mike Barnett would tell Gary that their sweet 11-year-old Jody had been groomed by this grown man for almost a year prior. And every time he went to the karate studio, it was one step closer to this abduction. It had started where Jody's boundaries were being tested by him and that he started touching Jody inappropriately, but would say it was an accident. And then when they were in the car one time, he actually put his hand on Jody's lap, and he then said that he didn't realize his hands were there, and that it slowly moved to the sexual assault that happened often. Hearing this, Gary was horrified. He told the officer that he was so distraught and that he would kill that SOB. And the sheriff had prepared for Gary to react like this. He knew his friend. He knew that he was kind of more talk than action, and no parent would be able to hear this news without having some sort of outburst. The news crews were set up outside of their home trying to get an interview from one of the parents while they were waiting for Jody to be returned. And finally, they caught Gary outside, asked him how he was, and that's when he said he didn't know what to do. He felt helpless. Gary spent the next few days while they were waiting Jody to come home at the bar. And he was trying to kind of soothe his pain and deal with what had happened and how he was going to help his son deal with what had happened. And he went to this bar called the Cotton Club, where he was talking to anyone he could about the case. He was asking them whether they thought that this karate teacher would ever be brought back to Louisiana or if he was going to be tried in California. And meanwhile, his wife June, and they were actually separated at this time, had lost 20 pounds from not being able to eat. Jody finally arrived at the airport in Louisiana on March 1st after 10 days of horror, and a news crew was set up at this airport, and of course Jody's parents were there and his mother was holding him, and June told him to just smile and act like he was okay because he was getting so frustrated with all the cameras in his face.
As a parent in your position, did you learn anything from this?
Just how much I love my children. I might be a little bit more protective or overprotective. I don't know.
March 1st, an emotional family reunion at New Orleans International Airport. Gary, June, meet Jody after his unexpected California visit.
Where's that gorgeous blonde hair? Are you okay?
How do y'all feel now?
Fantastic. Fantastic. It looks good. I love that back hair.
He doesn't at all.
What do you think about this whole thing?
I don't know.
There was just nothing like it. He was there. He was okay. He was home. I finally knew for the first time in 10 days where my son was.
He had told investigators that the day of his abduction he had been picked up from his home, but he instantly realized that they weren't just going around the neighborhood, that they weren't going in the usual areas that they always went in, and then they went outside of the neighborhood and they kept driving till it was dark outside. And then they stopped at a home in Port Arthur, Texas, where the man who Jody thought was his best friend, shaved his beard, and dyed Jody's hair black. This was a relative of the abductors. Now, after this, they began acting like father and son, and they went to a bus headed to the West Coast. When they got to California, they checked into this hotel. It was a very dirty, cheap-looking motel, and that's when Jody was sexually assaulted multiple times throughout that week. And then they went to Disneyland, they went to the Hollywood sign, and they were going all over LA as if this just really was a father-son vacation. After that week, Jody was desperate to get home. He didn't really understand why they were even there, and he didn't understand why he couldn't contact his parents and let them know what was going on. He didn't have a cell phone. This was not a time where there were cell phones. It's not like he could just pick up the phone and call them because his abductor was watching his every move. So he finally mustered the courage because, again, this man to him was not an abductor. This man to him was his best friend who had taken him on this vacation, and that he wasn't a bad guy due to all of the grooming. So that's when Jody mustered the courage to ask the abductor if he could possibly just make a phone call home just to say hi. And so surprisingly, this man said yes, and he immediately dialed the home phone number and got June. And at 11 years old, this boy saved his own life. Without that call, he might have never made it home. Due to the amount of sexual assault and this being in a completely different location, investigators didn't know what this man was going to do. Didn't know if this man was just going to keep Jody or, like in a lot of cases, would end up killing him. But when Jody was finally reunited with his parents, nothing was the same. Jody's parents began slowly asking him, why didn't you tell us what was going on? Why didn't you tell us you were in danger, or that your teacher was a bad man, or that he was doing things to you? And Jody said that he was 10 when it started, that all he knew was that this was happening, not that it was bad. He didn't want to upset his parents, and he didn't want his best friend to get into trouble. It was a horrific example of the perfect grooming of a child. He said it was easier for him to keep quiet than to upset everyone. And at this point, like I said, Gary and June were actually separated, but Jody was still their number one priority. But just as Jody was beginning this healing process, going to therapy, he had been to the hospital, he had finally told the truth, that's when his abductor was finally headed home to Louisiana for trial. Now, other than the news outlets that were going to capture this return home, nobody knew when or where this abductor was going to be and when they were flying him in. They were keeping the secret from the public, obviously, for everybody's safety, for this not to become this chaotic situation. And so it was around 9:30 p.m. on March 16th, 15 days since Jody had been home, when 25-year-old Jeffrey Dassett left the terminal of Baton Rouge Airport. He had 2 officers by his side, he was in handcuffs, and before anyone knew what was happening, a gunshot rang out, and the sounds of screams enveloped them all. The news crew quickly realized that they had just captured something that no one should have to witness, yet every local tuned in to WBRZ News saw it happen because it was live. There was nothing that they could do. They had just watched a murder happen in cold blood, and the gunman was seen as well, and he was wearing a baseball cap and a pair of glasses. But everyone saw right past that disguise because the officer would call him out. Because while the people at home reeled in horror, Gary, Jody's father, was being pushed up against the telephone booth poles, and he was being asked by the detective he knew, "Why, Gary, why?" He had tears in his eyes when he said every parent would have done the same for their child. Jeffrey Dassett was on the ground, deceased, or almost deceased. He was in a coma at this time from a gunshot wound to the right ear. Gary had walked up right next to him, held the pistol to his head, making sure he didn't hurt anybody else, but he wanted to make sure that Jeffrey would not survive. No one understood, though, how Gary could have known that Jeffrey was arriving at the airport at that time. It was top secret due to preventing something like this happening. And as Gary was hauled to jail, the public began theorizing maybe it was some of the officers who knew Gary and knew the family and wanted him to be able to get revenge but didn't want to get their hands dirty, so he secretly told Gary. Now, there is a full video of the live news broadcast, but I am just going to show you pieces of it because it is very graphic, and for people at home just watching the news to have watched this happen in real time, I can't even imagine. They had no warning. They had no idea this was going to happen. So I'm just going to play you a little bit of it.
As the suspect came through the airport, I readied my camera, raised it up to get a close-up shot of him. So I got a close-up shot, and as he got parallel to me, Gary Plache shoots and kills him. Gary, why? Gary, why? And to this day, it stands out in my mind. The shooter, Gary Plache, says, if it had been your child, you would have done the same thing too.
Today, Abram McGough is an assistant U.S. attorney and views that tape through the eyes of a federal prosecutor.
I would have to say the videotape was the most ideal witness in this case. You can actually see him take the gun out of his boot, pull it up to the shoulder lever of Jeff Dassett, and pull the trigger and shoot him.
It was soon found that the day of the murder, Gary had once again gone to the Cotton Club bar where he had a few drinks, and then he came in contact with an employee of WBRZ TV News. He had actually worked for this news company for a while. He knew pretty much everyone in town, from cops to the news, everybody. He was friends with them all, and so after talking for some time, this employee had mentioned something about their coworkers going to set up at the airport for Jeffrey Dassett to return. Now, when Gary heard this, he knew what he wanted to do. And he grabbed his sunglasses, his baseball cap, and he hid by the telephones. There were a line of payphones in the airport, and he knew he couldn't be seen by the news people, he couldn't be seen by the officers, he couldn't really be seen by anybody because, like I said, they all knew him, so he had to hide. So he pretended he was making a phone call, and then he actually did make one to his best friend. And he was kind of talking so he would blend in and not be kicked out, and that is when Jeffrey walked right through, and all of a sudden his best friend on the phone heard nothing but a gunshot, and Jeffrey was on the ground. He had pulled this gun from his boot where it was hiding and immediately placed it up to Jeffrey's head. Jeffrey was in a coma, then he was taken to the hospital where he officially died the next day. The footage that had aired on live television all over Baton Rouge, scaring the entire public, had actually ended up on YouTube after that, gaining 20 million views of everybody who wanted to click play and see an actual murder occur. This was not the cropped version that I played for you. This was the full-on scene. Blood, everything. And this was posted on YouTube, and then that was taken down and the cropped version was posted later. It also showed Sheriff Barnett, who was friends with Gary, talking to Gary, and Gary immediately putting the gun down. He had no real thoughts of harming anybody else. He had done what he wanted to do. But those who had seen this murder occur and those who hadn't didn't have any mixed thoughts. They kind of all had the same feelings towards Gary and that murder. They didn't think he should be behind bars. The media was flocking to anybody who knew Gary or could attest to him being a good man or a good father, and newspapers were calling this murder revenge of a wronged father, and he was being referred to as a vigilante father. It turned out that Gary had no prior criminal record. He had been born on November 10th, 1945, and had served in the U.S. Air Force as a staff sergeant. He went on to work as an equipment salesman, and he had a wife and 4 kids, and no one had actually ever seen him angry or do anything remotely scary. He was said to be a very loyal friend who was goofy, saw the beauty in everything, and he was very upfront with investigators, his lawyers, and everyone. While in custody, he actually told his lawyer that he didn't want Jeffrey to do this to another kid. He wanted to make sure he could not. He said that the voice of Christ had actually compelled him to pull the trigger. And his lawyer's name was actually Foxy Sanders, and he believed that Gary didn't have a choice. But no one knew exactly how this trial was going to end, if he was going to get time for a murder he did commit, or if the public was right and he was going to be released. Because it was said that everybody around town basically had already acquitted Gary, that to them he did no wrong. And many even helped to pay for his lawyer and give money and food to the rest of his family to be able to survive on when he was not working and in custody. And meanwhile, June was home with her 4 kids, including one who had just come home from being kidnapped and was still healing from that.
You asked Gary why.
I didn't have to. That was probably when I said to him, the least you could have done was let me drive you.
Everybody said that he did it for the love of his son and his pride, and he shouldn't be punished for that. Now, while at home with his mother, Jody ended up finding out that Jeffrey had been killed by his father. His mother came in and, very gently told him, and he ended up bursting into tears. And Jody had actually ended up watching the news broadcast, even though he was very adamantly told not to by his mother. He did, and he even taped it on VCR and was watching it over and over again to process what had happened, because he still had this a connection, as horrific as that was or not, to his abductor. And he also really understood why his father was angry, but not why his father had gone to those lengths to make sure Jeffrey couldn't do it again. June at this time was also trying so hard to get Jody's blonde hair back instead of that black, because it reminded all of them of what had happened. During the trial, the lawyer of Gary's actually argued that Gary had heard of what Jeffrey had done to his son and the year of grooming, and that caused him to fall into a psychotic state where he couldn't distinguish right from wrong. A psychologist even testified, saying that Jeffrey Dassett had been able to manipulate this entire family, to wedge into the family, to kind of separate Jody from his parents, from the people he trusted, and make himself that person instead. Gary ended up pleading no contest to manslaughter, and when it was finally time for sentencing, the judge simply said that any sentence would be counterproductive, because Gary didn't plan to harm anybody else but the man who did this to his son, and he was gone. So instead, Gary was actually given 5 years probation and 300 hours of community service. However, if he did commit another crime, it would be an automatic 7-year sentence. Now, many crimes like this have dealt with the balance of the law, and also what is being done for what the killers believe is the greater good. In fact, there was another case that would happen 31 years later in 2015, where another man named Jace Crahan would actually be referred to as a vigilante, kind of like Gary. Now, the reason I bring you this story is because Jody would later speak about this case. But with Jace, he was a 23-year-old who had started dating this 17-year-old named Brittany Monk. She finally confided in him that she had been sexually assaulted by the man who raised her. It was her mother's ex-boyfriend, and she actually abandoned them. And so this man had raised her for the last 10 years and had sexually assaulted her the entire time. At this point, Brittany was living with Jace. She was also 7 months pregnant with his baby. And when Jace heard about this, he was infuriated. He wanted to do something. That's when he came up with a plan to make sure he was no longer living. And Robert Noyce was his name. He had actually pled no contest to the many years of sexual assault of Brittany. He had gone to trial for this, pled no contest, and was then put on probation for 5 years, which is why Brittany was telling Jace about it at this point, because she feared him being released and doing this again. 2 weeks later, Jace handled this problem for her. Jace had gone to this trailer and stabbed, strangled, and stuffed Robert into a barrel. When Jace and Brittany were caught, Jace said that the criminal justice system failed his girlfriend and he didn't want her to suffer anymore. Jace was kind of talking to himself in the courtroom. He was crying. He was saying he was so sorry. He said that the knife that he had used was actually given to him by Brittany, who was in the kitchen, who had handed it to him, and then Brittany sprayed Robert in the face with body spray while Jace kind of wrestled him so Brittany could get in a few of the punches, which was about 10 to 15 times. Then in 2017, Jace was actually sentenced to life. However, there were a few of the juror members who did not agree with him being sentenced, and 3 years later, the Supreme Court ruled that it needed to be unanimous for a sentence to actually occur. So at that point, he was granted a new trial. Robert Noyce's brother actually said that they were cold-blooded killers who killed his brother for no reason but spite. Then Robert's daughter said that taking her father was not the answer to their problems, and she was robbed of a relationship with him. The judge was said to even believe that this was vigilante justice, but the jurors didn't agree. During the retrial, Jace actually pled guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to 35 years with credit for time served, and Brittany was sentenced as well, and this was for manslaughter, and she was given the same sentence. However, Brittany would come forward later saying that she wished she didn't plead guilty because she did not know that the judge would give her the maximum sentence for that, or almost the maximum. It was 40 and she got 35. Now, in this case, they were given the complete opposite treatment of Gary, who was thought to murder for almost the same reason, justice. Well, abduction victim Jody was actually an adult when this occurred, of course, and he was put into contact with Jace and Brittany's families. Now, he believed that Jace was this remorseful and loving person who was in a bad place, and that in his father's case, they hadn't even gotten to see if the justice system would fail them, but in this case, it was certain that the justice system had failed them.
It's similar because you had a loved one who killed for someone who had been sexually abused. That's what makes it similar in this case. The opposite happened here. He got the light sentence. There was no justice for a 4-year-old who had been raped for 8 years by giving a man probation.
By this point, Jody's father, Gary, had, of course, been living his life. He had never gone to jail, and he still to that day during an interview said that he didn't regret what he did. He would do it again. He was worried about going to hell, but he ultimately came to terms with that and was okay with it. But this man, dubbed a hero, finally had a stroke in 2011, put him in the nursing home, and then by 68 in 2014, he actually passed away. That is when his son Jody finally came out with a book he had been writing for decades. This was called Why, Gary? Why? And after not saying much publicly about his case or how he felt about his father killing his abductor, he finally came out to say that he didn't really agree with it.
I was like, oh, why would he do that? And everyone was going, Jody, you got to understand, your dad did this for you. I'm like, he didn't ask my permission. That's not what I wanted, so why would he do it?
This book came out because Jody said he wanted to give victims like him hope, and he wanted to teach parents what to look out for and how to keep their children away from people like this. He has said, it is what it is. I've embraced who I am and what I've gone through. That's why I wrote this book. Again, it's not about me or what Daddy did. It's about educating and helping other people. Jody actually revealed he didn't want to do karate in the first place. He had been giving a flyer in 5th grade, and he actually balled it up and threw it away because he was doing so many other sports. But his little brother wanted to do it, and everybody around was enrolled by his mother. So that's when he got involved as well, and at this point, the instructor they were going to actually didn't show up. And so they were then shown another instructor who was very new to this entire scene, and that was Jeffrey Dassett. He seemed not only to be a great, reliable teacher, but would also do extra things, such as taking the children to see a karate movie. He would even go to the family's birthday parties, and he got close to the parents, and he told Jody that one day he would take him to California with him. But Jody was excited about this. Jeffrey was his friend. After it had happened, he felt upset, and he felt like Jeffrey going to jail would have been enough for him. He said that his mother's calmness throughout the whole healing process is really what helped him to recover. She wasn't emotional herself. She kept it together and gave all of her strength to him.
I didn't know, but he feels so guilty. I mean, that's your baby.
Then came the act. No tears. Calm.
But he also said that his parents allowed him to really just recover over time and not push him in any way. And he actually went on to be a happy boy and then man. He graduated from Louisiana State University with a general studies degree and a minor in philosophy and psychology. And he then began to work as a sexual assault counselor in a place where nobody knew who he was. So he was able to help people without actually having to relive his horror, because at that point, All he wanted to do was forget about what had happened to him. It just kept coming up though. Every time he did anything, people would somehow know or figure out who he was. And he even tried to post cooking videos on YouTube because that was a huge passion of his. And instead of commenting about the food, everybody would just say that his father was a hero. That's when he decided to tell his own side of the story, and Jody said that he knew that his father, Gary, was a symbol of justice for many who weren't given the justice that they deserved. But he also said he just cannot condone his father's behavior, because instead of supporting Jody when he needed him most, he was in jail fighting for his own innocence. But Jody now appears to be very peaceful in life and doesn't really choose to be a victim, but a survivor, a helper, somebody who wants to make the world a better place. Somebody who learns the hard way how to deal with these people and what to look for to stay away from these people. And now he's using that to make sure no one else has to learn it the hard way. And I think that's beautiful. I really want to know, what do you think really makes the difference between somebody who is looked at as this true vigilante and has an entire community behind them, someone who doesn't even get any jail time, and people who get sentenced to life for almost the same exact thing? You could say it's because Jody was a child when this happened to him. But if you think about it, Brittany was a child as well. Her abuse started when she was 4 years old. And yes, they killed much later in life, but she was a child as well, so that really can't be it. And I really want to know what you think is right. Or is it something that is just special circumstances? Or do you think that Gary should have been in jail as well, and that everybody, vigilante or not, should have to serve time? I'm really interested to hear your thoughts down below. Please make sure, let me know what you think about this entire case. Have you ever witnessed anything on the news that was so horrific, that was so sudden, and that you will never forget? Because I can't imagine being the people in Baton Rouge watching the news, suddenly saying, okay, we're in an airport, we're seeing this man come through. Yes, he's a horrible person, we know what he did, but then suddenly seeing a murder occur when that's not at all what you thought was going to happen. I'm sure it traumatized many people for a really long time, and I do wonder if maybe that is the reason so many people were adamant that what he did was okay. Maybe seeing it made them feel like they were a part of it. I don't know. This is a very crazy case. I haven't seen anybody talk about it online, so I wanted to bring it to you. So yeah, don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay. Bye.